It begins with angry words or gestures.
It made me furious. And that's when I first began to think in terms of, well, you know, I'm going to kill this bastard.
Fueled by frustration and hurt, it explodes into violence.
While he was laying face down in a pool of blood, this man walked out, put a gun to the top of his head, and pulled the trigger.
Turning our workplace into a battlefield.
People can die if you make the wrong judgment here. And I urge companies to treat it with that degree of gravity.
Changing friends and co-workers into enemies and targets of rage.
They don't see the risk, and I think they're deluding themselves.
Each year, American companies spend millions of dollars to protect their employees from workplace violence. They install bulletproof glass, video cameras, and high-security doors to keep the bad guys out. But they often overlook the very real threat of violence that comes from within the company, from the cubicle or office next door. 12 dead in Atlanta, 7 killed in Massachusetts, 4 dead in Chicago. The numbers will continue to grow. How does it happen? Do good employees one day simply snap and start killing? Or are there clues in human behavior that we might be missing or don't want to see? In this episode of Investigative Reports, we'll examine the violent acts that scar our workplace and ask what can be done to ensure that we all stay safe on the job. August 5th, 1999, Pelham, Alabama. This quiet Birmingham suburb awoke to the sound of gunfire as shots rang out at Ferguson Enterprises, a heating and air conditioning supply center.
Pelham 911. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I just had 2 guys shot at my office.
Where is that, sir?
It's 141 Cahaba Valley Parkway.
Is the suspect still there?
No, he's left.
He's gone?
Yes, but there's blood everywhere. I think they're dead.
Mr. Cobb, who was the manager of Ferguson, arrived in the parking lot and heard loud noises coming from the building. And as he was entering the foyer of Ferguson, he was met by Alan Miller.
For 6 months, Alan Miller was a delivery driver for Ferguson. On August 5th, he went from co-worker to killer.
Alan produced a handgun and pointed it at Mr. Cobb and said that I'm tired of people spreading rumors about me. And Alan eased the gun down and Alan Miller left.
In his wake, Miller left 2 dead at Ferguson. Cobb would find the bodies of delivery driver Lee Holbrooks and sales manager Scott Yancey, both shot numerous times.
As police officers were responding, a second call went out that a similar incident occurred at Post Air Gas.
Miller had driven to Post Air Gas, an industrial gas supply company, and his former employer. There he murdered Terry Jarvis, the assistant store manager. 2 Pelham officers, ending their shift, spot Miller fleeing Post Air Gas in this beige Nissan pickup truck. They gave chase.
Once an adequate police personnel were present, they did a felony stop, and Mr. Miller was apprehended without incident.
Alan Miller surrendered without a fight, a loaded .40 caliber Glock handgun in his lap. In the days and weeks that followed, speculation about Miller's life and motives in the crime grew. People who knew him called him quiet and a loner. Was Miller hiding something? Was he a disgruntled employee? Did he simply snap?
I am here to tell you that never, ever happens.
Kevin DeBecker is a best-selling author and expert on threats and violent behavior.
Human behavior is like water coming to a boil. It's detectable along the way as it escalates, and nobody ever just snaps.
In the aftermath of workplace violence, experts often look for behavioral signals that may have been missed or ignored in the days prior to the act. They call these signals pre-incident indicators.
For 20 years, I've been asking victims of crime, could you have seen this coming? And invariably they say, no, it came out of nowhere. And if I'm just quiet for a moment, here will come all this information. Well, I did know when we hired that guy, or I did realize at the Christmas party when he said such and such, or I did see that he was, you know, having a Smith & Wesson bumper sticker or reading gun magazines or what have you.
Police asked the Pelham survivors about the days leading up to the shootings. But no one could recall anything that could have signaled the approaching storm. Throughout this case, there was only one clue that witnesses remembered. At both Ferguson Enterprises and Post Air Gas, Alan Miller proclaimed, "I'm tired of people spreading rumors about me," as he fired his weapon. It would be the last thing that Alan Miller would say. From that moment on, he wasn't talking. Facing a charge of capital murder, the defense brought in Dr. Charles Scott, a forensic psychiatrist from the University of California at Davis, to examine Miller.
The diagnosis that I felt Mr. Miller had was what we call a delusional disorder. And this is someone who has beliefs that in reality are not true.
Over the course of 3 days, Dr. Scott began to slowly unravel events in Alan Miller's mind.
One of the beliefs he had that was by the way people moved their lips, that they were mumbling about him and somehow were making fun of him and were spreading rumors. And that was a big theme in his mind, building up to the actual crime, that people were spreading rumors about him. Another belief that he had was that the way people would adjust their belt area or crotch area of their pants was an attempt to try to suggest to others that he was homosexual. And in his mind, he linked it like this: if they adjust their pant area, then I have to look in that area. If I look in that area, they'll then say, aha, this is evidence that he's gay, and therefore they'll continue to spread the rumor, and it'll grow from there.
A source at Ferguson told investigative reports that, to the best of anyone's recollection, Alan was left alone at work. He was never the brunt of jokes or rumors. Could the senseless deaths of 3 men have been prevented if someone simply paid more attention to Alan Miller? Dr. Scott doesn't think so.
Mr. Miller had a schizoid personality disorder. And by definition, this is someone who's very isolated, aloof, has few friends, prefers solitary activities, and rarely communicates what he's thinking or speaking.
Based on Dr. Scott's findings, Alan Miller's defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. It was an attempt to spare him from Alabama's death penalty. Throughout the trial, Alan Miller sat quietly and listened as both sides presented their case. He never testified or spoke in his own defense. Captain Tommy Thomas, the lead investigator on the case, sat a few rows behind Miller during the 3-day trial. Nearly 2 years after the crime, he remains convinced that the killings in Pelham were the acts of a vengeful man, not a sick one.
What Alan Miller reported to his psychologist and the psychiatrist, I look at that with a little bit of suspicion. I'm convinced that he's thought about this for a long time. I think he planned it on his drive to work that morning, that today's the day, that I'm going to kill these 3 individuals.
The jury agreed and rejected Miller's defense. District Attorney Robbie Owens prosecuted the case.
His own psychologist said, yes, he understood right from wrong. Yes, he understood that pointing a gun at somebody and pulling the trigger would kill them. Yes, he understood what he was doing. But he was angry over something that may or may not have ever occurred. In each of these 3 instances, there is an execution shot. Mr. Holbrooks was shot 6 times. Scott Yancey was shot after he had crawled up under a desk to hide and get away. In the 3rd instance, Mr. Terry Jarvis, he shot him 3 times in the chest. While he was laying on the ground, walked over, put the gun to him again, and pulled the trigger, standing there and looking at him. The jury determined at the end of hearing all of that testimony by a vote of 10-2 that the appropriate punishment was the death penalty.
Alan Miller now sits in an Alabama prison, awaiting his date with the electric chair.
Police communications, slow. May we help you?
Yes, we have a serious emergency at 1 Market Plaza.
January 28th, 1982, San Francisco. A workplace shooting in progress at Mission Insurance Company.
I'm on the 18th floor, and I'm barricaded in my office. I don't know. There's somebody outside shooting a rifle in our office.
Do you know if anyone's injured?
Huh?
Do you know if anyone's injured?
I just closed the damn door real fast, and I don't know. I just heard another shot a while ago.
Erlinda Kuntawi works for Mission. Moments earlier, her estranged husband, Ricardo, had entered the company's offices carrying a florist's box. Hidden inside was a 12-gauge shotgun.
He entered her workplace on the 18th floor of a high-rise building, proceeded to her desk, made a number of unintelligible comments, unintelligible by other people because he was crying and talking at the same time, and fired at her, hitting her in the leg, purposely wounding her, but commenced to shoot and kill people around her.
Chavez believes Ricardo wanted Erlinda to see her fellow employees being killed. He wanted his wife to suffer before she died. Ricardo made his way from office to office.
Office.
The man who had made the 911 call was killed while on the phone to the 911 operator. It's a sad case, a disheartening case that had a tremendous display of emotion by the person who was seeing the end of his life coming up.
It also is typical of many domestic cases that end in violence. The warning signs present were all but ignored. According to an Associated Press news article, Erlinda and Ricardo had a long-standing, troubled relationship. Ricardo was depressed and angry after losing his 15-year job as a hotel bellman. The couple had recently separated. And most importantly, Ricardo had previously threatened Erlinda, telling her that he would come to her office and shoot everyone there.
People are often surprised to learn that domestic violence and spousal abuse is a very important topic for workplace supervisors to be aware of, and here's why. About 40% of interpersonal stalking cases, which the majority of those are angry husbands, come to the workplace at some time. So the violence, the fear, the intimidation, the drama comes to the workplace. Companies need to be open to reports from women about what's going on in their homes, and most aren't. I have a client who a few years ago had a female employee report to her supervisor that her husband had held a gun to her head on Christmas Eve, but please don't tell anyone, she said. And the supervisor didn't. And about 3 weeks later, that man came to the workplace and killed his wife and killed himself there.
The shootings at Mission Insurance also point out a major problem within many organizations, the lack of planning directed towards workplace violence. San Francisco police officers had trouble responding to the call. As they took the elevator to Mission's offices, a 911 operator desperately tried to determine the office layout.
Is there more than one elevator?
Yes.
All right, now, there's 6 elevators.
As the elevator doors opened, Ricardo Kuntawi fired on police. He wounded one officer before being fatally wounded by returned fire.
The lesson to owners of buildings and employers who might operate on the 18th floor of a high-rise, or any floor for that matter, is to provide in advance floor plans to the law enforcement, if they can, to try to alleviate a situation like that. They don't create more casualties by their response.
Domestic violence is an organizational nightmare. The last thing most businesses want to do is become involved in the personal lives of their employees.
Employers shouldn't get involved in the personal life if what one means by that is going out to the home and standing by while she moves her things and so on.
Dr. Park Dietz is a forensic psychiatrist and one of America's foremost experts on the causes and prevention of violence.
What management has a responsibility to do is provide a safe workplace, and that includes providing a safe workplace for victims of domestic violence while they're at work, and for all the coworkers who could be injured by a stray bullet if a shooting goes down there.
One tool widely used by businesses in both domestic violence and stalking cases is a temporary restraining order. The order forbids the restrained party from having contact with the victim pending a court hearing.
The most serious problem with restraining orders is that they are not right for every case. They are a prescription that needs to be applied only to cases where they will help. And more frequently, it's applied to cases where they are the trigger for violent action.
Laura Black sought a restraining order in August of 1987 against Richard Farley, a co-worker at ESL, a division of TRW located in Southern California. Farley began stalking Laura in 1984 after she rejected his romantic advances. Farley was fired by ESL in 1986, but even that didn't end the harassment. In this interview, Laura explains how she reluctantly decided to seek a restraining order against Farley.
It came to my attention that this might be impacting my advancement at work. And that was when I finally said, okay, it's worth taking a chance on. And the day after the shooting was the day we were to appear in court to make that temporary restraining order permanent.
On February 16th, 1988, Richard Farley returned to ESL looking for Laura Black. He shot and killed 7 people on his way to finding Laura. He then shot her in the back, leaving her for dead. The restraining order was a final insult to Richard Farley.
I feel that was the catalyst that pushed him over the edge.
But Laura Black was lucky. She didn't die that day. She recovered and stood in the courtroom to face down Richard Farley. Her testimony helped convict him.
Far too often we see that the shooting happens on the day that the restraining order notice is served or when the parties are to appear in court. So I start from the presumption that a restraining order is too risky to the victim's safety.
It is a risk that desperate victims like Laura Black often take and live to regret.
A restraining order sometimes gives people a false sense of security. The holder of the restraining order is not necessarily a safer person. Restraining orders are not a bulletproof vest, and they do not prevent you from fatal injuries.
It's not unusual to hear an employee complain about their boss. At one time or another, we've all had bosses that made us feel abused and angry. In this next story, you'll meet a man whom we'll call John. We're disguising his voice and identity, and in a few moments you'll understand why. John came to investigative reports through a counselor to share his story of an abusive boss and the anger that began to consume his life, an anger that pushed John to the brink of murder.
He was the sort of person that if you don't do things exactly like he does, he's not happy with your job. You're doing it wrong if you're not doing it the way he does.
John is describing life under his new boss. After 10 years in the purchasing department of a major textile company, John's world was turned upside down when his company was taken over by a competitor.
He would make derogatory remarks about my food and drink selections or my clothing or my office to me personally and to other people in the office and even to customers and clients when we would be out on business occasions.
For months, John told us he tried to fit in, to do his job exactly as his boss demanded. When that didn't work, he took his concerns to human resources and finally to the vice president of purchasing, his boss's boss.
Purchasing and the vice president of purchasing turned around and informed my boss that I was complaining about him.
His boss labeled him a disciplinary problem. He wrote warnings and placed them in John's employee files. John was now on the fast track to being fired.
And when that happened, I knew that my days were numbered and was just outraged that I had, been with this company far longer than he had and had a good reputation and had a good work record, and here this, this petty little dictator was going to harass me out of work. And it made me furious. And that's when I first began to think in terms of, well, I'm going to kill this bastard.
John's plan was simple. He was going to ask his boss for a private meeting in his office. He would then shoot him in cold blood.
I was going to take the pistol out and I was going to shoot him in the head and in the chest. I was going to use Glacier safety slugs, which are a round that basically eviscerates the person you shoot. If you shoot somebody in the head with a Glacier, it blows their eyeballs out.
During our interview, John brought out his gun. He dressed in his shoulder holster. demonstrating how on more than one occasion he easily carried the loaded weapon into his office.
Certainly, I was at the breaking point. I had come to the point where every morning when I would get up and go to work, I was mentally rehearsing the act.
On a hot August morning, John made up his mind. Today was the day his boss would die.
He had called me in actually to do a disciplinary meeting again. It was my second write-up, so I was 2 strikes. I was almost fired anyway. And it was at that moment that I thought, you know, the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. You know, this is against the laws of God. It's an evil thing to do. You'll destroy your life, you'll destroy your family's life, you'll destroy your friend's life. So when he started up his little spiel, I said, you can just hold your breath. I'm giving you notice, I'm quitting.
Quitting cost John a career, but saved his life. He now works in the healthcare field and is seeing a counselor to work through his close brush with violence.
Chances are excellent that if I had gone through with that, I would either be on death row now or in prison for life. And my family would have been destroyed. Yeah, it's frightening to think that I would ever contemplate such a thing.
John still lives in the same town, and to this day, his family, friends, even his ex-boss, don't know how close he came to committing murder.
As a matter of fact, I ran into him in a restaurant not too long ago. And I can remember sitting and thinking, should I go speak to him? And so I got up and went over, and we had a very nice chat. But he has no idea.
In the mind of a troubled employee, there's a fine line between violent thoughts and violent action, and that line is easily crossed. Case in point, April 6th, 1999. An ex-clerk named Pierre Lebrun walked into this bus garage at OC Transpo, the public transportation service of Ottawa and Carrollton, Canada, armed with a .30 caliber hunting rifle. He shot 6 employees, murdering 4 of them. He then turned the rifle on himself and committed suicide. Lebrun left this suicide note, one that spoke volumes to a long and troubled history of mental disorder, including delusions and paranoia. But his note also spoke of his torment at the hands of his fellow employees and management of OC Transpo. He wrote of how he felt pushed to the brink and that he could just not take it anymore. Nearly a year after the crime, a coroner's inquest found some truth in Lebrun's note. Dr. Peter Collins, a psychiatrist that advises the Ontario Provincial Police, wrote of OC Transpo as a poisoned environment, a place where Lebrun was repeatedly harassed about a speech impediment and facial tic. Jerry Smith has seen this type of behavior before, where a company's denial of a problem leads to an escalation of violence.
It should have been stopped, it should have been addressed, it should have been nipped in the bud. Any kind of taunting or teasing in that way is an act of abuse towards a colleague, and it's certainly showing disrespect to that colleague and his disability.
Smith leads the trauma response team at Warren Chappell in Toronto. The company is the largest employee assistance provider in Canada. While Chappell wasn't directly involved in the OC Transpo case, Smith studied police reports of Lebrun's rampage and the coroner's inquest while researching his recently published book, Work Rage.
He was the one who was being harassed, but he felt that he could never address it. And the one time he did try to address it, he was terminated because he assaulted someone and he lost his right to be there. The fact that Pierre mentioned this in his last words seemed to indicate that he was not happy with the outcome of any kind of complaint they may have had in the workplace. And that's the sad part, because it can be addressed. He's more to be pitied than scorned, really.
A question that remains is if the atmosphere at OC Transpo facilitated the repeated harassment of Lebrun, where else could he have turned?
Obviously, if the person who is causing the abuse is your boss, then it becomes difficult to address. And so I would encourage employees to go to their HR department as well and make a formal complaint, but have good documented episodes of the types of behaviours, because if it's just a kind of a hearsay thing, then people are not going to pay too much attention to it. You need good documented evidence of what's happening.
Jerry Smith views the LeBrun shooting as a tragic wake-up call to all businesses.
The big message is companies have to take responsibility for making their workplaces safe for everyone from any kind of abuse, whether it's abuse from a manager, or abuse from a colleague, or abuse from a customer, or abuse from a personal relation who may come to the workplace to do harm.
And what about those companies that remain unconvinced by the murders at OC Transpo? Those companies that still proclaim that workplace violence can't happen here.
How do you know it won't happen? Do you follow closely all of your employees? Do you monitor them? Do you know what's going on inside all their heads? And in fact, they don't know that. They don't see the risk, and I think they're deluding themselves.
If any one organization were considered synonymous with workplace violence, it would have to be the United States Postal Service.
August 1983, Johnson, South Carolina. 1 dead, 2 wounded.
Right or wrong, this reputation has grown out of a rash of shootings across America.
August 1989, Orange Glen, California. 3 dead, 1 wounded.
The worst incident of postal violence occurred in Edmond, Oklahoma, August 20th, 1986. Patrick Sherrill, also known as Crazy Pat, killed 14 co-workers and wounded 6 others before taking his own life. This one act cemented America's image of the U.S. Postal Service as a dangerous workplace. Going postal became the popular slang for employees who killed their own. Dr. Michael Mantell, a psychologist from San Diego, counseled the survivors and victims of Patrick Sherrill.
The going postal phrase that was popularized by Jay Leno in the media back in the 80s, a tongue-in-cheek approach to unbelievable tragedy. I have never seen anything funny, humorous, or anything close to that, because I've seen 15 dead bodies. I've seen bullet holes in walls. I've seen blood. I've talked to children of postal workers, spouses of postal workers. There's nothing funny about it.
The U.S. Postal Service agrees. For years, the Postal Service has charged that the media has made its 900,000 postal employees an object of ridicule in the face of tragedy.
The bottom line conclusions of this commission are these. Going postal is a myth. It's a bad rap. It's nonsense.
In August of 2000, they backed up their claim with evidence. A 2-year independent study on workplace violence in the Postal Service.
That's number one. Number two, postal employees are only 1/3 as likely as workers in the national workforce to be victims of homicide at work. Indeed, the Postal Service, as you'll see, is one of the safest places in America that you could work.
But the study also shed light on continuing trouble spots within the Postal Service. One area of concern is the Postal Service's zero-tolerance policy.
The Postal Service has a zero-tolerance policy against violence. And we asked, one is, do you think it's effective? And two, do you think it's fair? The blue line is effective, the red line is fair.
According to findings published in the study, only 14% of postal employees who report incidents of violence believe that the offender will be disciplined in a satisfactory manner.
I am frustrated with the fact that if there is zero tolerance in the Postal Service, what the heck is that? Is that zero? You know, what is zero? A number, just like I am.
Meet Janet, a veteran letter carrier. She is one employee who has little faith in the Postal Service's workplace violence prevention program. She asked us to protect her identity as she shared with us her view of life inside the Postal Service.
There have been fights. You know, people aren't fired. People are sometimes promoted after they've fought. And they're now telling somebody to not fight. You know, it makes us think, guy, you know, people can get away with murder here. People can get away with hitting somebody or verbally abusing somebody and being rude to customers and employees and still maintain their job. And that's not right. That's not what it's about. That's not zero tolerance. You know, zero tolerance is zero.
Other sources of frustration noted in the report include discrepancies in salaries and an overburdened procedure for addressing employee grievances.
They note 126,000 grievances are backlogged. And in 1999, they dealt with a whopping 6,300 grievances. That's just astonishing to ask a workplace to deal with that many grievances.
Postmaster General William Henderson agrees that changes need to be made.
The grievance arbitration process was created in the 70s, the early 70s, when the Postal Service first came under the National Labor Relations Act. And it was designed to create central control, not to have local resolution, but central control at Washington, because the United States Postal Service didn't have any experience with the National Labor Relations Act, and there was a learning process. But 30 years later, central control is nonsensical. Disputes should be resolved in post offices, managers held accountable, and union representatives held accountable.
The grievance issue is significant in other ways as well. It demonstrates an angry division that has historically separated management and craft employees, like clerks and letter carriers.
Sometimes I think that management would step on their own mothers to get where they're going. And then I look at sometimes and I see where they want to have constant anger back and forth. You know, they like that friction. Why they like it, I don't know. I've had them watch me. I've had them belittle me. I've had them talk to me like I was, you know, the slug of the earth, kind of. And it's pretty demoralizing.
One possible theory as to why postal employees are exposed to this type of treatment is reflective of both the organization's size and the makeup of the employees who work there. Larry Chavez explains.
There were assurances made to me when I was in the military, when I was returning from Vietnam, that your seniority points would count toward the civil service, specifically the post office. There were a lot of people that truly believed that and went into the post office for that reason, right out of the military.
Approximately 35% of all Postal Service employees are military veterans. That means that more than 1/3 of all postal employees grew up on drill sergeant discipline.
The only style of leadership that they knew was the military style. As they rose in through the ranks, all they could make reference to was the style of leadership they had in the military. And to the extent that it's tolerated within the post office, it will then flourish.
I'd like to give this report to you.
Many of the recommended changes made in the August report are aimed directly at reducing the underlying stresses that lead to workplace violence. The recommendations include improving systems for tracking violence and potential violence, overhauling the outdated grievance process, and improving the screening of applicants to spot potential violence before it happens. Publishing the report and facing up to its problems are a good first step by the Postal Service to end on-the-job violence. For carriers like Janet, weary from years of bad postal jokes and worse experiences, it's a step that can't come too soon.
I really wish it would just stop. I wish it would stop because, you know, it's totally not necessary. There are good people that work for the post office. There's a lot of us out there that want to work and do our jobs and go home to our families and live a happy, fulfilling life and be productive. And then there's those chosen few that are angry people and bitter people, and they take it out on whoever they come across and get away with it. And the Postal Service allows it.
An employer's responsibility to the prevention of workplace violence begins long before the first employee is hired and extends well past the day the employee leaves or is fired. Nowhere was this lesson more evident than in the case of David Burke. While his name may not be familiar, David Burke's actions changed air travel forever. The date was December 7th, 1987.
David Burke worked for U.S. Air. He was an employee who, if they had backgrounded him, they would have learned that he had a substantially serious background involving theft and stalking and other problems, but they had not done an effective background. When they fired him, they didn't take away his pass, so he was able to board an airplane without going through the metal detector.
Burke boarded Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771 by flashing security agents his U.S. Air credentials. They waved him in, along with a borrowed .44 Magnum revolver, right through security, without question. Burke chose PSA 1771 because his former supervisor, Ray Thompson, was on board, flying from L.A. to San Francisco. Shortly after takeoff, Burke passed a note written on an air sickness bag to Thompson. It read, "Hi, Ray. I think it's sort of ironical that we ended up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family, remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none."
He shot his supervisor, and the pilots radioed that they heard gunfire aboard, and then the next thing that's on the black box recording is somebody entering the cockpit and a few shots there, and then of course the plane crashes.
The crash killed 43. David Burke is the reason that everyone, including pilots and crew, must now pass through a metal detector before boarding any commercial flight.
It is a chilling reminder that employees who give all the pre-incident indicators need a lot of attention and certainly cannot be left with their passes and certainly cannot be left with .44 Magnum handguns. And also a reminder that we get an opportunity when we hire people to learn something about their background, and we ought to take that opportunity.
As is typical in many workplace violence cases, termination triggers violent behavior.
The worst possible way to terminate someone is in a manner that the employee sees as unfair, humiliating, and more proof that the organization is horrible and everyone he's dealt with is a terrible person. The best way to terminate someone is in a manner that reflects a fair process, that takes account of the needs of that individual employee, that respects their privacy and their dignity, and that instills some hope for the future.
Experts like Gavin DeBecker and Park Dietz train companies on how to reduce the chance of workplace violence. They offer these suggestions as a place to start. First, put a greater emphasis on the way employees are both hired and fired.
People are often amazed to learn that most employers in America do not check backgrounds of their employees. Most employers in America do not even take the simple step of calling the references and the former employers. And some of the reasons are that they think the employers won't tell them anything because of concern about liability. But that is not a reason not to take such an obvious step. We would do it with a babysitter. How could we not do it with somebody that we're exposing to hundreds of others in the workplace and that we're exposing to customers in our business?
Second, respect the fears of employees and act when problems are first reported.
The truth is that the average supervisor wasn't hired to be a prison guard or a detective or an amateur psychologist. He's hired to supervise workers, and he needs to know that it's not his job to fix the problem when there is an arrogant, demanding worker, or when there is a threatening, hostile worker, or when there's a sexually harassed worker. His job's to get HR and security in the loop so that they can teach him how to handle this.
And finally, take all threats seriously. A threat is often the last warning sign of potential violence.
When you have an employee who begins to introduce such things as intimidations or threats or manipulation or escalations, it is really time to begin looking at getting that employee out of the workplace. Probably the most common single feature in cases that escalated to violence is that everybody knew that person had to go, and nobody had either the courage to do it or the will to do it early.
Gavin DeBecker has even developed a computer program to help companies examine threatening behaviors and predict the likelihood of violence. He named it Mosaic 2000.
What it's meaning to do is to code your case so it can be compared by computer to cases where we know the outcome. And it can tell you that in the opinion of experts, your case is most similar to those that are likely to escalate or most similar to those that do not escalate.
Ultimately, companies that avoid workplace violence are those that recognize the potential dangers and invest in prevention.
It is a very important element of the workplace that prevention programs be given the same due as responsive programs. It is far more helpful to your employees and helpful to society in general when we anticipate and act on things that need never happen, victims that need never become victims. That is where we want to put most of our attention.
But some of their attention is also being focused outward, towards another possible link, the media. Both De Becker and Dietz feel that the media, specifically television, could be the breeding ground for future workplace killers.
Just as responsible journalists do not give front page coverage or headline coverage to suicides because they know it causes copycat suicides, responsible journalists should not give such coverage to mass murder because it causes copycat mass murder. If you want to know why there are more school mass murders in the U.S. over the last few years, you only have to look at CNN. If you wonder why there are more workplace mass murders in the last few years, you only have to look at CNN and the saturation level coverage provided.
On July 29, 1999, news organizations from around the world focused on 44-year-old Mark Barton, a chemist turned stock market day trader who killed 9 and wounded 12 others at 2 Atlanta brokerage houses. Barton also murdered his wife and 2 young children, bringing his death toll to 12. The very next day, 2 more people died at a Charlotte, North Carolina trucking firm. 6 days later, Alan Miller murdered his 3 victims in Pelham, Alabama. Could media exposure trigger these crimes?
What should be the worst day in someone's life becomes the best day in someone's life if you are Timothy McVeigh and you're whisked in and out of buildings in full view of the media, an armada of helicopters takes you to your court hearing and you're basically presented as if it's a big deal. Others see that and say, hey, that doesn't look so bad. This guy gets to vent his anger and hostility and then gets a lot of attention. And the way that the media and law enforcement have conspired to make a big deal out of people who do big bad things tends to encourage more violence.
And while these tragedies help transform the Mark Bartons and Richard Farleys of the world to instant media celebrities, do they also plant the seeds for future tragedy?
To give saturation level coverage of one loser's shooting in some obscure place does no good and only harm. It gets people killed. How do you balance a theoretical right to know or be titillated against getting people killed? For me, that's easy. Don't get people killed.
While the media may be criticized for their coverage of workplace violence, it remains one of the few places to discuss these issues in an open forum. Larry Chavez told us that most corporations are sensitive to the damage an employee shooting can have on their public image and profit margin, and therefore refuse to talk. That may explain why in case after case, our request for interviews about these incidents were denied. Take Mark Barton's Atlanta rampage, for example. At the time of this taping, there are over 20 lawsuits pending in this case. And with an average settlement of $5.1 million paid per shooting incident, it's no wonder most companies choose not to talk. But this wall of silence can have dangerous consequences. It just may get more people killed. I'm Bill Curtis. Thanks for watching Investigative Reports.